by which we will recall two important milestones in the modern history of the Czech Republic. That's 20 years since we joined the European Union and 25 years of our membership in NATO. It is a great pleasure indeed that we were able to invite great speakers for both panels who will give us their views on these important events. And I will leave further introductions of everyone to Jan Macháček, Chairman of the Board of the Institute for Politics and Society, who will moderate both panels tonight. We hope that you will participate in the debates by asking questions and giving out your comments. After the first part of the evening, we will invite you downstairs for some refreshments and a glass of wine where we can continue with less formal discussions. And by the way, the cakes are also real. There is one minor change in the program. As you know from the programs, we invited Mrs. Věra Jourová, Vice President of the European Commission, to deliver opening remarks tonight. But unfortunately, due to some last-minute changes in her program, she cannot join us tonight. So in this case, I will already give the floor to Honza, who will guide you through the evening. Thank you very much and enjoy the Prague House tonight.
Thank you very much, Lucia, and thanks all of you for coming. And I would like to thank once again Prague House, who is co-organizing our event. I would like to thank Renew Europe and MEP Martin Hlaváček for arranging the support of Renew Europe. And I would like to thank my colleagues from the Institute of Politics and Society for helping to organize it. Věra Jourová announced yesterday afternoon that she has some duties in the parliament and it's an institutional must, so she apologizes and says hello. So, but we will have a lot of excellent panelists in both panels, and I think we will be able to enjoy our evening even without our most prominent institutional speaker. So we would have two panels. You know, the first one would be devoted to the anniversary of the EU, second one to the anniversary of NATO, and we will proceed with the first panel. So I would like to introduce our panelist. First, Professor Jacques Rupnik, who is well known both in Czech Republic and France, but not only in these two countries. He is an expert on Central Europe, and he is equally well known in Poland or Balkans. So welcome, Jacques. Ivan Hodač used to be called one of the most influential people in Brussels, since among many things he was, for instance, a chief of automotive, what was the exact name? Automotive lobbying organization.
No lobbying.
Representation, okay. Representation. Yeah, okay. And we have Martin Hlaváček, MEP, member of European Parliament for ALDE Party and Renew Europe and ANO movement. So my name is Jan Macháček. I am a moderator of these two panels. We will have approximately 45 minutes for each of the panels. So I would ask all the panelists on this panel for their introductory 5-7 minutes. It's up to them, but I would like to hear from them definitely what, according to them, was the most positive achievement for new members of European Union, for the EU, and from the point of view of all the EU. With emphasis on what was most surprising, perhaps, for you, what was not that obvious that it's going to happen in 20 years from now. and what are your disappointments and what are your concerns about the or even worries maybe about the future. So we would start with Jacques according. Martin wants to be the last. Okay, so.
Okay, good evening. Thank you for the invitation. Following on the question that was just asked, what are the main achievements or what is I would say the most important, probably in retrospect, the most important thing, entry into the European Union provided an anchor for the post-89 transformation, the new democracy, anchor for the new democracy. That is true for the Czech Republic, but it is true for the whole Central European region. The fact that democracy then fares differently afterwards, that is no longer, I would say, the fault of the European Union necessarily, but that was the most important thing. If you want the post-89 transition, consolidation of democracy, European integration, that click, and that is a major achievement. Then I would say, looking back, I would say a major achievement was to provide for Czechs, but also for Slovaks, after the separation, after the trauma of the separation of Czechoslovakia, a new framework for not just healing that separation, but framework for their relationship. It was not an obvious thing, and it was the two nations joined Europe separately, but within the European Union abolished the border that they had just created. So that is an achievement of sorts. And we can, of course, look at today Czech politics and Slovak politics somehow diverging, but on the whole, that relationship has been a very good one. Not only, but also due to the membership, to that joint membership of the European Union. I would say the second observation I would make is relates to the Czech European narrative. If I look back at the post-89 period, you had two major figures with two very strong European or Eurosceptic narratives. Václav Havel, Václav Klaus. They were the dominant political figures. They had very strong and very strongly divergent views about Europe. I need not say, but you remember Václav Klaus' formula, are we going to dissolve our sovereignty and our identity in the European Union like a lump of sugar in a cup of coffee? Okay, so this was Europe as a threat to our sovereignty and our identity. And Havel, on the contrary, having a very pro-European narrative, saying, I don't see the problem. Threat to identity, sovereignty. I'm from Prague, I'm Czech, I'm European. These three things are interlocking, interdependent. And if anything, he was advocating a European constitution long before it came on the European agenda and was defeated, as we know. And was a sort of European federalist of sorts. Yeah, you can call him that way. So you had two very strong, and of course the emphasis on values, that Europe is not just, you're not just joining a club that will give you subsidies to build this and that and the other, but it is joining a club of democracies, a club of shared values. That was the strong. So you had two very strongly divergent approach to the EU. And what I would say today, if I look back at that, I would say you don't have anybody of stature who has a strong discourse on Europe, who has a strong argument or a strong view. You have a lot of politicians, some of them articulate, some of them less so, but on the whole, Czech politics has evolved towards some kind of Euro-pragmatism. Not a bad thing. I mean, this is after the two very radically opposed narratives, you have a Euro-pragmatic approach, and that is in many ways useful. I know our time is short. I would simply say, you want to compare how this change materialized. Remember the first Czech presidency, which imploded in the midst, and which started with the famous, I don't know even how to translate it. My to osladíme, to Evropě osladíme. Yeah. Anyway, not too complimentary about Czech intentions vis-a-vis this European institution. And you compare it with last year's Czech presidency, which I think everybody has accepted as effective, efficient, the honest broker. Anyway, what you expect from a member of the European Union, not a new member, already, after 20 years with some experience and which delivered. So that is how far we have moved. Am I doing for time? One more minute or two? Okay, one of the emphasis in the early, if we take back the 20 years ago, if this is our point of reference, the idea was Czech Republic joins the EU in the context of the Visegrad group. And the whole point of the Visegrad group was not just to have a negotiating position in the accession process, but also then to have more weight within the EU after. Well, if we compare that situation to today, I would say, forget it. The Visegrad group is 2 + 2 now. and you have seen the meeting in Prague recently, where after their meeting, they concluded they didn't share that much in common. And the Czech Prime Minister and the Polish Prime Minister went to see the Czech President, Mr. Pavel, and the Slovak Prime Minister and the Hungarian Prime Minister went to see the former Czech President. Anyway, so that parting of ways, if you want, symbolically and politically. So the idea that the Czech strategy would be with the Visegrad group to have more weight, no. Today it's more ad hoc coalitions on different subjects. Czech partners need not be just their neighbors. On different issues, they can be different partners. I must not be too long, and I'll leave that for the discussion. Of course, the important thing for the future is what are the new challenges and where the Czech Republic fit in them. And these will be the defining moment for the Czech attitudes. I will just mention them, and we can return to them in the discussion if you wish. One of them is the euro. That was initially supposed to be a commitment. It didn't happen. And there is an economic argument that I've heard from Jan Švejnar, among other economists, who says, well, if you're doing 3/4 of your trade with your Eurozone partners, it's your best interest to share, to be part of it, because your transaction costs go down, etc. I'm not an economist. You will have a position on that. Therefore, I cannot say if this is but clearly this is not a sufficiently strong argument. The argument has to be, at the end of the day, a political one. Does the Czech Republic want to be in the core of the European Union, or is it satisfied to remain, if not on the sidelines, let's say in the second circle or on the periphery? And as I say, this cannot be decided simply by economic arguments. This is a political one. And similarly, this will depend on Czech capacity to see the EU as a political project. And that has been lacking. I mean, I said Europragmatism, but Europragmatism means you're not quite sure what you expect from the European Union. And I will not develop that now, but simply say we have challenges, the energy dependency, climate, the war on our doorstep, and the whole security dimension of the European response. This is not economics. These are political challenges. This is Europe as a political project, as a political animal, if you want. And therefore, are the Czech political forces and the Czech public opinion, by the way, prepared for this kind of view of the European Union, this kind of role of the Czech Republic within the European Union? That will be the question of the future. It didn't have to confront it until now. It does have to confront it now.
Okay, thank you very much, Ivan.
Yes, thank you very much. It's always very difficult to speak after Jacques, especially if you are a lobbyist. I remember I started at the College of Europe in 1975-76. I stayed there afterwards for 4 years. I was teaching there, and I know Jacques is teaching there now also. I was very envious to the young people who came from countries that belonged at that moment to what was not called the European Union, but what was called the European Economic Community. I have hoped in 1975 that one day I will be able to say that we belong to that group also. I was there with my mind. I was there with, physically and mentally, but I regretted that we do not belong to the group of countries with which we today share common values. And I think that's the first thing that you have said, and I fully agree. For me, the most important thing is that we were able, after 89, after the development that happened in 89, that we were able, rather shortly, 15 years later, we were able to join a group of countries with which we share the values of liberal democratic society. That's for me one of the key, and that we are firmly anchored in Europe. It was extremely difficult for me before 89 to hear that you are Eastern Europe, this is Western Europe, etc., etc. No, this was Europe. And I was rather allergic to the whole thing. So today it is different, even though it's the latest development is again moving maybe a little bit in the wrong direction. I would go slightly in a different way that you did because I would repeat. I don't want to repeat what you have said. What I appreciated very much are certain things like Erasmus, to give to the young people the possibility to study abroad, which we didn't have. The free movement of goods, people and capitals across the borders. When we were talking about Schengen, at the beginning, people did not know what it is. Today, Schengen is very much a part of the EU, and I'm very happy that we belong to that group. There are lots of people who believe that it has always been there, and I think it's extremely important to make sure that people understand, especially the young people, that it didn't come for free, that it was extremely difficult to get there. I think that we should not forget the economic growth and everything which we have got, from which we have benefited. We always very often we criticize the European Union, we criticize the regulatory framework and everything else which is happening, but we have to take the positive side of it. And I think that economically we have always benefited as a country from the belonging, the membership in the EU. I think that when I look at the negative sides, if you want, and you have asked us to say what could have been better. There are things, of course, but maybe one of the first things is communication. We have never been able to sell, in inverted commas, to the members of the EU the benefits they have from the EU. The people in the Czech Republic, the normal people, don't understand what is the EU bringing to you. And in fact, as long as the butcher who is making his sausages on the border of between Czech Republic and Austria will not understand that he makes them in the Czech Republic and sells them next morning in Austria, that this is due to the existence of the EU, then I think we will never be able to succeed. I think we have not always used the opportunities that were there for us. And it's pity. I do regret the split which you have mentioned about V4. I have believed a lot in the V4. I have used the V4 in my work here in Brussels, and suddenly I see that the V4 is disintegrating, and it goes hand in hand with another development, which on one hand was extremely positive. And is turning a little bit sour. We have been looked at, and we felt it that in the East we were looked at as the latecomers. Sometimes they were looking at us as country or people who were standing there with stretched hands and waiting for the economic goods, and where there was something to give, especially on the migration policy and the migration problems in 14-15, it was no. And after the Ukrainian, after the invasion of Russia, of Ukraine, suddenly the importance and the respect of the Central and Eastern Europe, the Central Europe has grown. And it's unfortunate that it happened at such a moment and because of this development, but we have seen clearly that it's not only Poland, also the other countries, that we were looked at in a different way. And unfortunately, what we see today, because of the developments in Hungary and in Slovakia, it's changing. And it would be bad to lose. It would be bad for us to lose this what we have got, the recognition that we have got the last 2-3 years, then the pendulum was swinging more to the east, and I think it's something that we should make sure that we keep. I would finish by underlining that what you have said, that it was and it still is a political union. It has been originally political, meant as a political consolation through to which we get through economic integration, and I think we have to understand that. And last but not least, I will finish with this: we have to also understand that nothing comes for free. That if you get something, if you have benefits from the EU, from membership in a club like the European Union, you have to also have obligations. There are challenges, there are benefits, and there are obligations. And we have to respect this. As far as the presidency is concerned, last remark, I believe that the first presidency was not as bad. As you've mentioned, I think we have achieved a lot. There were lots of hiccups. There were only 2 countries that have where the governments fell during the presidency. One of them was Denmark, and the second one was the Czech Republic. I know them both very well. So the rest is for the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So perhaps Martin, you can try this microphone. Maybe if there are some noises, it's maybe not from the microphone, but we'll see.
Okay, thank you very much. I was thinking how to approach this, because we have always a list that journalists and other analysts are making for us of the pros and cons, and I agree with the colleagues that mainly they are economically oriented, and I'm often torturing myself because perhaps I had the luxury that I was still born and raised a bit under the Iron Curtain. Then I had the luxury to go and study through the times after the Velvet Revolution. And then I jumped into my professional life as a very young diplomat and one of the first round of diplomats who came into here just before and right after the accession. And I often try to recall what was our mood, thinking, also motivation back then, and how we reflect on it and how it has developed. And I try to synthesize that, whether this could be something that could be in parallel symptomatic to the population. Because to put it simple, we were all young, enthusiastic. We still remembered something that my daughter never will, that we could not freely travel. We could not have roaming for free. We could not have benefits. But sometimes we try to sell the benefits that the new generations, they can't accept. They can't understand, because for them, this is no longer of a value. This is a normality. And with that, we try to struggle a bit. But back then, we were enthusiastic. What was like the amalgam of, I think, back then for many of us, the younger generation, but still with a little bit of reflection of the past, was like, we need to enter into the club. That was a challenge, no? We were finalizing the chapters. We were sweating to finalize the chapters. We saw if some had more problems like Slovaks, this is not for granted. Then we finally made it, both into NATO and EU. And then we said, well, soon we have a presidency. This will be our first. It will be a kind of prestige. And that was another, let's say, connecting factor for many. But then after presidency, I would say since then, there was like a little bit of vacuum, not only for the politician, also for the society in a way. And I think at those moments where we celebrate at the same time, but try to reflect, and what is more important, how do we sustain? And I just want to touch upon two elements that I hope you will find the same challenging at the same time, but also relevant as I do. What did we like fail the most? What did we like fail the most to sustain in having a mindset that is no longer just a materially pragmatic, but giving something higher, but at the same time could unite older, middle, and younger generations for continuous support? Because if we risk that, we will have inevitably a problem. So we should address it. And I often think about it, but I came to a point at the moment when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we had an emergency meeting, because in Parliament we have always emergency on everything. We have very little sometimes to do around that, but we have emergency. And the first emergency meeting right after the invasion, when we discussed what happened, what kind of shock that was, multiple of my colleagues were sitting in the same group, but are from I like to say that now, Western part of former Union. They didn't understand our, let's say, deep anxiety and also a concern that was around that. Some of them even, as is a life example, said, perhaps now we should consider what China will do, because there might be an effect of Chinese proliferation in the world policy. While we were discussing at still like the 2 nights after that happened. And back then I realized what we failed in, I think, how little, and I blame myself the same way I blame a lot of people around here, because I know multiple of you for 20 years being here, how much we failed in not allowing the former part of EU, meaning the old Europe, to learn and understand about us, about our territory, about our history, about our context. It was like in full scale visible what kind of still difference in perception of such a big event that was the invasion was there, and how our thinking and their thinking back then, it has changed lately, yeah? When they saw Bucha and other things have changed significantly. But back at the moment, so that was one of the elements, and I'm still stretching my thinking very often where to get there. And then another element that I think will be very relevant for the future, and I don't want to arrive here in the usual political way, what is the recipe in going forward, also from the optics of our population? Because people often try to simplify. Yeah? For many problems, more integration, more federalization would be the fix, would be the remedy, while some say, no, this is the other way around. We are not here today to go in those waters, but being here for 20 years, not as a politician for that long, but where I see a big dynamics that happened, maybe we noticed that, maybe it came a little bit like invisible, and it was proliferated later. But I think one of the major elements that has impact on people's feelings about Europe and European integration, and not only in our country, but also in other countries, is the permanent conflict they see when they look at Brussels. And why I see Brussels? Because from my experience now as a politician, I didn't perceive that before. When I was a bureaucrat or in other roles in business, people don't distinguish institutions. People don't distinguish council, commission, and the parliament. People simply don't. And even those who you explain once or twice, they forget very soon. But what they see, there is a permanent conflict in Brussels. For them, this is Brussels. And when we look at that, we have to ask, do we have less conflict? And then a chance to maybe be more appealing for people with the integration idea or the idea of the community, or we have less? And my personal feeling is we have more. And one of the root causes of the fact that we have more, that we have allowed, say since end of Barroso, roughly, but then through Juncker and von der Leyen administration, we allowed Commission to become a very political entity. I still remember coming here in 2004, that Commission was never perfect, but back then, by definition, it was an organization that was like an arbiter. No, I said something on behalf of Czech Republic, my colleague on behalf of Germany, and the Commission came, look at the data and said, he is wrong, he is right, or both are wrong, they are cheating me. The reality is here. Someone like an impartial element. And because there was a decision that there is a need for the benefit and more appeal of peoples of Europe to increase the reputation of the Union, it would be a good remedy to have increased political involvement of the Commission. I personally am afraid that this is not working. This is not working because it has at least two impacts that people soon discovered. First, the more political you become, the more authentic, the less authentic you get, because suddenly your decisions are no longer fact, evidence based, but they are more of political nature. And people see it. And it also helps politicians in member states to point at it. Say, look, they had in their analysis these figures, but politically they decided differently. And they use it. Sometimes they abuse it. And it is an easy target. It is an easy target then for many to erode again the whole setup. And also the politicization, and then naturally gets into a more conflict between institutions, because Commission is lacking what? Legitimacy, but having a lot of expertise. Parliament is increasing its legitimacy through election and competences, they are growing, but we have very weak expertise. Okay, someone has forgotten to develop along the line the same. And then we have a council, they still have both, because they have the ministers with the ministries, they have a lot of good expertise, and they have also the political legitimacy. But then it breaks down into a clash into a member states. And I think we should try to reflect on this in the moments like this, and then try to think whether sometimes the remedies we are offering going forward would really amalgamate more people, especially in our country, that is to big extent much more skeptical about the EU integration than others for many reasons. I think we could have historical analysis, but I think we should also blame all of us and at the same time media and many others for the lack of it. But at the same time, we should realize whether this could not even increase the gap rather than getting it closer. So this is what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So I would like now to have a question on each of you, but I unfortunately, I have to ask for quite a brief response. So for Jacques, I prepared the question. Isn't the problem of the EU that it is still a project or an experiment? It's not in a stable state. Is it sustainable when we all know that EU is too complicated to understand for so-called normal people? Is there any chance to do something about it, or 30 years from now we will have even more complicated arrangements with remembering Václav Havel, who also asked for a very simple, brief constitution, etc. But I know that it's for a studying PhD, but anyway, try it in few sentences.
Well, you're absolutely right. Václav Havel's recipe for constitution, a short text that could be understood by all, including kids in high school, etc. You know, stressing the fundamental values, the basic institutions, why we're doing it. That's it. Instead of that, they produced several thousand pages. Anyway, you know how it ended. Yeah. Well, do I have a remedy? The remedy was once called subsidiarity. And I believe it still remains a principle. And my answer would be just do it. Subsidiarity. That is, you devolve where possible, where necessary. You devolve. However, there are now key areas, I mentioned some of them, where all of us see that the answer is only a European answer. Take any of the major issues. Take the climate. Take migration question and the Europe caring for the European border. Take vaccines. Take exactly the pandemic and the way the EU responded. And of course, now take the war in Ukraine, and you want to have a common response. You want to have sanctions on Russia. You want to have a common procurement for munitions or whatever. This is politics. So this is answer to you. This is politics. This is as political as you can get. So in a way, my answer would be less bureaucracy, devolution. You know, shrink the size of the constitution if that is what. But keep the focus on the main issues. There has been in the Czech Republic, but in other countries in Central Europe, there was initially a certain idea of what the EU is. First, there was security and defense. Well, that's NATO. That's what we're going to be talking about in a moment. Then you have politics, democracy. That's a matter for the nation state. And what you have in between, well, it's Europe. It's a single market, and some of the rules and regulations that are necessary to operate the single market. That's the Brits are out of the EU, but this is, if you want that was a British view of, to cut it short, of what the EU stood for. And it was quite convenient for many in Central Europe. That was their view. Today, that is no longer good enough. The challenges I've mentioned, all of them, the economic challenges, migration, climate, etc., including pandemics and the war, these are political challenges, and you cannot do without politics. But concentrate on the essentials. Devolution is my answer.
Thank you. So I have a different question, Ivan, since you are from business. It will have to do again like with sustainability of the EU, but this time it's about economic growth. If you look about economic growth after the financial crisis in 2008. US is having like at least 2 times more dynamic growth. European Union is quite stagnating as far as the growth is concerned. Is it sustainable, and are we doing enough to change it? Maybe it's a dream for some. Some people were hoping that we are too much focused technocratically on growth, so perhaps now their dreams are coming true. But you are from business, so is it sustainable without growth in the long term?
Well, I don't think it's sustainable. I think what we see, the way, and I'm looking at the economic segment part of you, not on the political one. And I fully agree what you have said about the political side. We have to simply make sure that the United States and China, just by the way, is not going to run away from us. We have been losing completely the side of the global competitiveness of the European industry, and that has to go back. And it goes through, the regulatory framework, which is very cumbersome, the bureaucracy, and many other things. The single market, which we cherish so much, and we talk about it, still doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in full. There is a single market, but there are still lots of problems that in the economic side are there. So the business community appreciates very much what has been done. The business community appreciates the free movement, but the business community, as finally, I think that Ursula von der Leyen understood in her last speech when she said, I want to bring back the competitiveness of the European economy, of the European industry. Well, that means that we have not been doing anything for it. And the industry complains. She has said, I will cut down 25% of the regulations. That we have been saying for ages, it has never happened. And it has to happen. Part of it goes to subsidiarity. We should concentrate on a regulatory framework that is sustainable, that guarantees a global competitiveness for the European industry, and that puts us at the same footing as far as the development is concerned, not only with the United States but also with China. And the last thing is, you are comparing us. You have compared the United States and Europe. The key to the global competitiveness for Europe and for the United States is very close cooperation between those two entities. Without that, we will have global problems that we haven't seen it before, because we talk about China, but India is there, other countries, and if we do not work together with the United States, we will really not get back on the competitive edge. We always believe that we have technological advantage. We have said, Chinese are nowhere. Not correct. We don't have anymore the competitive advantage, the technological advantage. The Americans, the Chinese, and the Indians have it as well. So that's what it is. It is not sustainable.
Thank you. So the question for Martin would be, so you mentioned that Commission and Parliament are becoming too political. It's also some people might consider that it's also becoming more like active generator of some utopian ideological recipes. But now you change your position, or 5 years ago you changed your position. You are within the engine of the EU, within the Parliament. So what are your proposals to do something about it, about this, that people feel more and more that there are very utopian goals being generated from these, mainly in the Parliament, actually?
Well, I think the main concern that people will always reveal, and people, I don't mean just our citizens, I mean also businesses, is the mismatch between the expectation and the reality. And here we are making, all of us, but institutions, whatever you will, we're making mistakes we should avoid. Sometimes they are very simple mistakes that are easy to avoid, but we are still making them. For example, we have not adopted yet a clear logic that complex issues do not have simple solutions. I know it is more and more difficult in a world, and we see it not just in EU, we see it globally, where political activism is running politics. Or professional activism, if we talk about pressure groups, is running politics. More and more political decisions are run or driven, if you will, by professional activism rather than a professional representatives. To have Ivan on my side. This is a little erosion we allow to happen. Second, I like very much what Jacques Rupnik has mentioned. We don't have to, I translate it in my simpler language, we don't have to do everything. We have to do what makes sense to do together. But very often, maybe you notice the same way I do, that these are areas where economists say these are externalities. Health, sustainability, or environment, if you will. These are all areas where you are fixing by public intervention a market failure or market imperfection by an intervention. Intervention can be different. Huh? You regulate, you limit, you impose, you sanction, you pay, whatever. But you are entering it. And if someone studies the history of economics, especially in areas where externalities occur, you need to have a certain level of a wealth of a nation or organization or a population to afford this. And we are now at the crossroads where we have a combination of factors. On one hand, we have over-proliferated in fixing the externalities, even in areas where maybe this is not necessary, but we have forgotten that there is no automatic endless support, and we have forgotten on the wealth side. This is what some people call easier the economic part of sustainability or the economic viability behind that. And I agree with Ivan that we will even struggle to achieve on those goals because very automatically we will lose support. And then when we turn it into politics, I think this is an interconnected area. When we support people's enthusiasm for fixing something they perhaps wanted 5 years ago to be fixed, because simply they see their impact on their lives and businesses has been different than what was their expectation, because we are not able to monetize the externality. This is always the biggest problem. We are promising European businesses, they will monetize on those externalities, while at the same time, they are confronted with a global competition that has no need, either obligation, to monetize on them. And then suddenly, someone wakes up in the morning and sees we are importing Chinese cars. Would we have thought about it 5 years back? Likely no. And what is the remedy? And this is, I think, a second simple example where we repeatedly commit the same mistake. When we have a problem, often in Europe, we don't come back and try to fix it. We don't come to the cause of the problem. We try to find a remedy how to fix the impact of it. The typical example was when we had the first hiccup with Franz Timmermans on some of the climate laws, and he said, no. We made it wrong, but we should not go back and change the assumption. We create a fund. So whoever will be affected of our wrong assumption, meaning impact, we print money to fix it for him. And I think this is often a logic that we have. We don't like to admit we made a mistake and come back to fix it. We rather invent something new to fix the cause, not the cause, but the consequence.
Thank you very much, Martin. So unfortunately, we have to close the panel and go to our next topic, so that we will get to the dinner and refreshment at some point. But I would like to thank Jacques Rupnik for his interventions, to Ivan Hodač, thank you, and to Martin Hlaváček. So and I would like to ask the participants of the second panel focused on NATO. So thanks, gentlemen, for coming. Co tady děláte? Of NATO. I would like to welcome the panelists, starting with Jiří Šedivý, former Minister of Defense, former Ambassador to NATO, and currently Chief of the EDA, European Defense Agency. Am I right? Okay, thanks. So welcome, Jiří. I would like to welcome Jakub Landovský, still an Ambassador of Czech Republic to NATO, and soon the director of Aspen Institute, Central Europe. Welcome. And I would like to welcome Petr Luňák, who is the deputy head of communication department of NATO, by the way, who has been serving in NATO for almost from the very beginning of our membership, almost 25 years. So when I mentioned that unlike that EU is still being considered a project or experiment, it seems to me that nothing could be different with NATO. Maybe fortunately for us, NATO is not considered an experiment or a project, but a stable and functioning institution. And hopefully a little bit less complicated. Maybe I am mistaken, but we know that if something happens, if A happens and B proceeds and C happens, so there are rules and procedures and the institution is functioning. But maybe I'm mistaken. Also, the attitudes of the public also in other regions, our regions of Europe, is that NATO is much more popular and much more trustworthy than EU. And so I would like to ask all the panelists to reflect on this, and also to tell us if they consider NATO stronger and healthier than it was before the Russia's aggression into Ukraine. And what are the main challenges? So once again, and this time I would like to ask panelists to be a little bit shorter than the panelists in the first panel, so we have some time for your questions, because we had to cancel this part for the first panel. So 5 minutes for Jiří.
Thank you very much, Jan, and good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. First, small caveat, I'm now working for European institutions, so whatever I say is my personal view. Now, actually, I followed in preparing for this discussion the panel description that you provided with the questions, and so I would like to construct my argument against actually first the concerns and even fears that accompanied the discussions about NATO enlargement, about the impact of new members, and based on that, actually, I will reflect on the Czech Republic's contribution. Now, if we look back into the second half of 1990s, when we were trying to get into NATO, and it was not for granted, there was a lot of opposition in the West, and there were essentially 5 arguments that were somehow trying to put in question this enlargement. First of all, the free riding. There was expectation that the new members from the post-communist countries will be free riders, not contributing enough. Then the question of cost. There were some estimates that actually the collective defense of those new members could cost, and there was a Rand Corporation study up to over $100 billion. Then there was a question of military interoperability, very technical thing, whether the non-militaries would be able actually to work together with the traditional ones. Then there was the question of security risk, assumption that through those militaries, actually spies with links to former Soviet Union, Russia, would be infiltrated into the alliance. And then it was the question which I forgot, but I've got it in my notes, the 5th one. Yeah, and public support, indeed. And there was an assumption that at least 50% of the population should support NATO membership, and we were a bit struggling with that. Yeah, but in the end, and what is important is that actually in the past decade, at least between 60-70% of the Czechs actually support NATO membership. Now, a few milestones which actually illustrates how Czech Republic, Czechia, managed to be a reasonably good ally. And first test, 12 days after the official entry into NATO Operation Allied Force, Karel Kovana remembers that very well, how difficult it was actually not to break consensus. But in the end, we managed. It was also actually quite a big blow to the public support. It was very divisive. But okay, we survived that. On the other hand, another highlight, 2002 Prague Summit. And it was a big, indeed, sort of a, I would say, homage to Václav Havel, to Czech Republic, and to the essential success of enlargement. In the meantime, 2001, 9/11, and the whole story of Afghanistan started, and this was really the biggest test, I would say, so far for us, for our military. And here we really proved very, very well in terms of starting with the contribution of our special operation forces in the Enduring Freedom operation, then the International Security Assistance Force, ISAF, and a lot of very high level, high value added capabilities that we contributed. I will just mention HIP helicopter training and the delivery of helicopters to Afghanistan, medical capabilities, the CBRN, which is chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear detachment, several times actually protecting Kabul airport, provincial reconstruction team in Logar, NATO training mission, military police deployment of the special operation group, etc., etc. We've done a lot. And this was something which was also extremely important for the professionalization of the Czech armed forces. The conscription was concluded or stopped in 2004, and indeed professionalization is a long process. Yeah? When you stop conscripting, doesn't mean that you are professional. But Afghanistan helped very much in that respect. Another important moment in terms of Czech contribution I should mention was air policing. And actually, our first rotation of air policing over the Baltic states was in 2009. It was coincidentally actually decided when I was minister, despite certain hesitations on the part of the military. In 2006, we decided actually to be able to deliver this until 2009. And it was really exceptional because only a few years after introducing the system, the Gripen system, actually we were able to go out first to the Baltic area. Later, actually, also over Iceland, which included air-to-air refueling, etc., etc. So, very good, very well. Now, 2014, another milestone, the first phase of the war against Ukraine, the change of the posture of NATO towards collective defense, and again also reflected in the activities of the Czech Republic. So, one thing also I should mention, actually, which is another, I would say, case in point and proof of the respect for the country. And it was the fact that in 2017, the CHODs, the chiefs of defense of NATO, elected General Petr Pavel as their chairman. And he said, and he was absolutely right indeed, the president is always right. Oh, not all presidents are always right. No, but he said, and this was very correct, that this is indeed not only recognition to him, but above all, another proof of the success of the transformation of the Czech armed forces. Now, last points. Okay, not everything is rosy. In terms of, I mentioned interoperability. It's eternal challenge. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. But we are definitely not the only ones in NATO in terms of coping with interoperability. And this is also linked to, and it's also one of your questions, the modernization, to what extent actually the Czech armed forces managed to modernize. And again, here indeed, I must refer to very unstable budgets. The last time actually we, or Czech Republic was investing 2% of GDP was 2005. Since then, actually, it was very volatile, which had a very detrimental impact on capability development, on modernization, on meeting the obligations for the especially NATO defense planning process. And there was a period, 2010 and few years later, when actually the budget was oscillating around 1%, sometimes below 1%, but still, and this is important, operationally, the Czech armed forces were always able actually to deliver high value added. But unfortunately, and this is the problem that is being not solved so far, but actually now things are improving with the increased budget. This also created sort of a two-tier armed forces. One part of the armed forces actually fully interoperable, operationally capable, certified by NATO, but indeed at the expense of other parts that were underfunded. So, but now with that was a huge defense investment gap, a huge debt actually accumulated. But I believe that now it's being solved. And here I see you that you want me to stop. So thank you very much.
Okay, so Jakub.
Good evening, everybody. Let me start with paying homage to my friends and colleagues around me, because they have served in NATO in many cases longer than me, this case, and they are part of the success that Jiří was now describing to you. Speaking about how long you serve in NATO, our current dean, and Jiří was a dean, is Mario Nobilo. You probably still remember him. And when he was receiving congratulations on his deanship, he said, you know, guys, I would die for NATO, but I don't want to die in NATO. And this is exactly what we are talking about. This is a 75 years old organization, born out of crisis, always able to reinvent itself within the crisis that's following. And I will pay homage to our dear Secretary General, who served now for 10 years. His tenure is coming to an end, and he made a tremendous impact on a transformational period in NATO, which I think roughly started around 2014 and then really gained speed through the Russian aggression in 2022. And he's always saying something. He says, I don't believe in Europe alone, and I don't believe in North America alone. I believe in Europe and North America together. What does it mean? Can only someone from Norway, which is a country who borders Russia, is outside of EU, but very good partner, very good cooperation, or is it transcendent? Is it something more? I think it's the latter. And you don't have to believe in continents to exist, but you have to believe in institutions, as mentioned before in the panel, because institutions, they run on trust. And talking about NATO and EU is not talking about just some organizations. NATO is an alliance, and European Union is a political union, and more important in the political sense. So it's not membership you can choose a la carte, it's a commitment, and I will speak about the commitment in a minute. By the way, I can do it in 3 minutes, and I don't carry any papers because all the papers in NATO are secret, and we are used to do 3 minutes intervention, sometimes 5 if you are French. These two cooperating together, bringing security to more than 1 billion people. But here comes the trick. 1 billion out of the 8 billion on this planet are so-called collective West, the Western value-based democracy, and NATO is very much founded around 3 values: freedom, democracy, and rule of law. It's basically a bunch of countries sitting around a table with 14 articles of the North Atlantic Treaty to solve all their problems appertaining to security and defense. And it's amazing how many things were reinvented or put into action from the 1949 now. Now back to our membership, 25 years, some countries are celebrating 20 years, some 10. It all started in Prague. It was a hefty period of the 1990s, which are leads to Petr Luňák, who knows all about it. But what I see when I look in the retrospect, it's not only the good things that Jiří mentioned. I also see when we entered NATO, we almost immediately stopped to pay our dues. And it's important to admit that if you are getting some rights, you must always comply to also some obligations. It's also a problem of collective rights that are not usually accompanied by collective obligations. And it's very important that right in the middle, in 2014, we started to repay this huge debt in capability. And we served in Afghanistan well, which kept us in shape, despite the debates about how Afghanistan ended. By the way, it's not a very popular debate in NATO. We cannot talk about Afghanistan much, to be honest. We arrived to the year of my tenure, 1919, summit in London, space as a new domain. Things were going better and better, but the crisis was not still materializing in a real sense. But then the fateful night of the Russian aggression. And I cannot, erase from my brain the initial discussion in the NEC. It was mentioned in the press. It's very sensitive, but some of the countries really didn't believe that the Ukraine is worth of our support. They didn't believe that it will last longer than a week or 3 weeks. Czechia was not one of them. In the morning, we have gathered together with the eastern flank countries minus Hungary. We have asked for the Article 4. We used the procedure to respond quickly. And slowly but steadily, the countries started to gather help. But it was so important to keep the core duties of alliance untouched by the possible escalation of NATO involvement in the war, that NATO was basically shielding the activities that the allies, and there is a distinction, we're doing to support Ukraine, which will be in this year of 75th anniversary, the big test and the big shadow looming over us in the sense how this celebration in Washington will really go on, because it will be very different if the Russians are advancing towards Kiev and the front is collapsing, then, or in comparison to the situation where the front is stable or Ukraine is able to defend itself, or even better, because every summit is under the influence of the situation in the battlefield. The case of Vilnius and putting forward the agenda of Article 10, open door article towards Ukraine. And now the argument number one, because we are sometimes unable to formulate the strategic ends to our security needs. Sometimes it's difficult. Afghanistan is a primary case because we weren't really able to say what we want to achieve, in what time frame, and when to leave. And now with Ukraine, we are in a similar situation. But it's important to compare the cost. And our societies are sometimes really good at comparing costs and running out of the data and number situation we have. And in this sense, it's important to make one remark. This protection of 1 billion people costs roughly 1.25 trillion US dollars per year. The number of countries contributing to this pouch is increasing. Now with the latest wave of enlargement, basically NATO and EU countries are more and more overlapping and becoming one. There is only 5 countries, so-called Western European partners, which are for reasons of history neutral. And this big pouch will be either staying the same or being much more expensive for the future, depending on the result of this conflict in Ukraine. And the amount of money needed to sustain the Ukrainian war effort, and I'm not one of those who are playing or toying with the idea of sending troops, because the deal as it stands, it's that we will help to support Ukraine in a material sense, and Ukrainians will fight for their freedom with our support, is roughly between 100 and 200 billion dollars a year, which is less or comparable to the cost of war of Afghanistan to the US alone, not adding up the cost of other allies, and not adding up the cost of war in Iraq. Our societies were completely complacent for paying this cost for 20 years. There was no war fatigue, there was no problem with our economies. Everything was running smoothly, despite the fact that we haven't formulated our war goals. And I think it's important to sustain this effort and to shield, and it's very important, to shield our individual activities by transferring more and more powers into NATO, which will be one of the 3 big things, one of the 3 big things in summit in Washington. It will be recounting the effort of pledge in Wales, so 2% and above, it's a floor, not a ceiling. It will be support to Ukraine, long-term, stable, predictable. Also, peer pressure could be applied because some allies are doing much more than other allies. I'll tell you a statistic really surprised me. Denmark alone pays more on Ukraine than France, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. So it's important to bring some sense of co-ownership and some sense of peer pressure and equal sharing of the burden into the matter of support. And NATO is above all a perfect organizing framework for defense that's able to bring interoperability, sense, logistics, organization, peer pressure, and political heft, and also protection, very last remark, from the political winds on the both sides of the Atlantic, which can really change the situation. And that's why we need NATO and EU working together towards our shared security.
Petr?
Thank you. Perhaps I should start by correcting one misperception that might have sort of emerged from Jan's introduction. You said that I've been with NATO since the beginning. Well, I have not been with NATO since 1949. I only joined in 2000. No, I'm joking. No, indeed. Back to the original topic of this panel. Well, let me just say a few words about why I think enlargement was actually good for NATO, because that's something that also should not be taken for granted. Because the discussion or the decision to create a NATO-based European security system was actually taken very early. President Bush, I think in already 1990 or 1991, said to hell with it. We won the Cold War. We will be the one, we will organize European security in line with what we want. That was fine, nice and dandy, but it was not clear what it would actually entail in practical terms. In practical terms, it actually meant enlargement of NATO in 3 dimensions, and geographic enlargement of membership was not the only one. In fact, the first one was functional enlargement. Basically NATO putting sort of collective defense, I think not always wisely, on the back burner and doing other things, doing out of area operations, which brings me to the second enlargement, which is operation, out of area operations. The whole mantra, out of area or out of business. And indeed, NATO membership, inviting new members, was the third dimension of that. Why was it good for NATO? Well, I think first of all, it strengthened, it reinforced legitimacy of NATO as such. Had NATO not enlarged, it would have been a sort of ramp organization in the West. There would have been some sort of no man's land in between, and back then, sort of cooperative, but potentially, revisionist and angry, as we later saw, Russia. So I think in that respect, in fact, NATO enlargement legitimized enlargement itself, legitimized NATO as the pivot of the European security system, which I think it was good for the long run for the alliance. It was good for Europe, and it was good for the United States. There were many who doubted, who had serious doubts. Jiří mentioned 5 reasons or 5 counter arguments. I would add actually probably three more. From the sort of more historical perspective, it is a putative non-enlargement pledge, which I think has acquired dimensions of the second Yalta myth. That on the basis of 2 sentences that Secretary Baker told Gorbachev, a hypothetical question he asked him in 1990 was overblown into some sort of pledge not to enlarge NATO, which is totally false. That is a sort of historical argument which was used against NATO enlargement. The second one was political, that by enlarging NATO you will actually create new dividing lines. The net result of NATO enlargement will be just moving, NATO border a few hundred kilometers eastwards. Well, again, I think those naysayers were proven wrong in the sense that actually NATO did quite a lot to include Russia to the extent possible, to what it was doing by all sorts of, was it permanent joint, creating permanent joint council, inviting Russia to one table. Well, Russia ultimately decided differently, but that was a choice. And the third one was military. I mean, along the same lines as the political one. The third argument against NATO enlargement, that basically, that Russia will feel encircled by NATO enlargement, which again, if you look at the facts, was completely wrong, because NATO also made a sort of unilateral declaration that it will not deploy nuclear weapons and substantial multilateral, combat forces on the territory of new member states, and actually was until recently the case. So in fact, there are many I wouldn't call them revisionists, but alternativists who are saying we should have done it differently. In terms of timing, in terms of procedure. I think they are wrong. I think this is. I'm not saying that everything was perfect and dandy, but ultimately, I cannot fathom a better way, or sort of a more constructive way of the way of NATO enlargement. Now, 2 more points as to what post-Cold War enlargement brought to NATO. I think the 3 and then more members brought 2 things to NATO. First, I think a healthy dose of historical pessimism. Basically, that the kind of 90s, the kind of nirvana, almost harmony that we saw in the 90s, to the extent possible, would not last forever. That there is always, that we should be somehow skeptical with. We always talk about the Obama reset, but there were many resets before that. There was a post-Kosovo reset. There was a reset with Russia after the falsified elections in Ukraine in 2004. There was a reset after Georgia war, and actually. The Czechs and the Poles and others, they were always skeptical. They were skeptical when some leaders looked into Putin's eyes and saw his soul in it. Or when a Western leader wrote a letter, an open letter, where he was arguing that Russia should be invited to NATO. I think we were those who were actually, I think, healthy. There was healthy skepticism on the part of us. And the third point, I think, in terms of subtle contribution by new members to NATO was also healthy faith in Atlanticism. Yeah, when many started talking, I mean, we had crises in the alliance, no question about that. You know, being the Iraqi crisis, being it very difficult period of the Republican administration a few years ago. But the gut reaction from some other members was always strategic autonomy, or I think on the side of the members there was more in terms of strategic patience, or even embrace to some extent. To make sure, because the worst possible outcome of these crises would be actually distancing Europe from the United States. And I think in that respect, the contribution of new members, including our beloved countries and others, was actually quite substantial. Thank you.
So I will have a few questions, but I would ask for absolutely brief response if possible. So one would be for Jiří, like what were the liabilities of going to Afghanistan, being there for such a long time? These were like expeditionary forces. Now NATO has to focus absolutely on territorial integrity only. We collected experience with integrating with others there, but wasn't it a completely different kind of thing? And now we have to focus into something completely different.
I wouldn't say that it was completely different. Indeed, it was expeditionary. At the peak of the Afghan operation, it was 130,000 actually around 2009-10. So logistically, it was a huge challenge. But at the same time, it had a great impact on increasing the overall interoperability amongst the allies. As I said, it had a positive impact in the professionalization of the Czech armed forces. And if you look at the top military management today, almost all military leaders in Czechia actually went through operations Afghanistan and elsewhere. So, if we speak about, for example, one of the main challenges of collective defense, potential collective defense of Europe, it is military mobility. So it's still about mobility. It's still about deployability, about the capacity to sustain logistically a combat force. Now it's in the eastern border of the alliance. There used to be a notion actually, which was used by the Social Democrats. I remember Kavan and I'm not going to name anyone else. Pejoratively, Afghanization of the armed forces, and now that the armed forces should be de-Afghanized. I think it's completely wrong. It was good experience. It helped really, at least partially, to modernize. And now we are in the enhanced forward presence in Lithuania, etc., etc. So it was good, and indeed now we are changing the posture.
Thank you for this explanation. So I understand, Jakub, that you have to sometimes face the consequences of political leaders saying strange things, like starting with Macron calling NATO brain dead, and you mentioned former US president seeing a soul in Putin's eyes, etc. So, but now we have a little bit confusion about a very important and sensitive topic, which was raised by President Macron, that perhaps NATO troops should be somehow deployed in Ukraine, and we have very different responses, even within some particular countries. Like, for instance, in Poland, you have a foreign minister who says, like, NATO troops are already in Ukraine and we should thank them. And there is a red line for Germans. So could you comment on this possibility, if for normal listeners who are not experts into
sending strategic signals to your adversaries is an art. France is one of the last countries that can practice this art. Problem is when you send a signal and you don't follow through, then something like an asset becomes a liability and you are losing your credibility, which is an indispensable part of a deterrence. And deterrence is an activity to deter your enemy not to do something. So the result of deterrence is inaction, basically. I think it's good to be ambiguous to a certain degree. It might help. I wouldn't dare to comment on President Macron or Minister Sikorsky. I would only point out one thing. You should also think about your home audiences, because the people's support to the governmental policies also depends on their perception of how far the war will carve into their lives. And in this sense, examples of elections in Slovakia shows us that there is a price to pay in domestic audience perception of these words. And that's why I think Secretary General, and I'm representing NATO, said nobody is seriously considering sending NATO troops to Ukraine. And that's, I think, not following through on this ambiguous signal some tried to send to Macron. Last thing about Afghanization. Afghanization is a wrong term. In NATO, we talk about terrorism and state threats, Russia, namely. And the good news is that now we have a unitary structure, because fight against terrorism is the easier out of the two tasks or two threats to handle if you can choose, because collective defense means large quantities of troops, higher degree capabilities working together in a much larger theater than expeditionary action towards terrorists somewhere who are an asymmetric enemy.
Okay, thank you. So in the previous panel, we mentioned economic growth within the EU. So isn't it important also for NATO that countries in Europe are growing economically for their defense? Because if we speak about these 2%, for instance, if we look at the case of Czech Republic, we even had negative economic growth. So, and I said that other European countries are going to be basically stagnating in the next few years. So what's NATO's position on economic growth and defense spending?
Well, that is a good thing. That's our position. That's for sure. But perhaps, you know, in terms of figures, look, indeed, 2024 is the time when all NATO allies should have spent 2% per year on defense. We are not there yet, frankly. The estimates are that 18 out of 32 will meet that goal. It's not, well, 18 is not 32. At the same time, it's compared to 2014, when, if memory serves me right, it was only 3 member countries who actually met that requirement. It's 6 times more. First. Second, cumulatively since 2014, if I'm not mistaken, $650 billion have been added to defense NATO-wide. This is significant money, and in fact, if you take cumulatively figures, the ratio or the proportion of the defense budget of European and Canadian economy altogether. Europe and Canada is spending, taken together. I know that it's a bit of a equilibristic, but already spending 2%. Not every country, but taken collectively together, it is 2%. That is no excuse for some countries not spending enough. But let me. I also read, and this is not from NATO sources, read a scholarly article claiming that if 4 or 5 big spenders, big countries spend 2%, we are safe. I'm not saying that, but apparently that's one of these sort of analyses that basically there is, if 4 or 5 big countries spend 2%, there's enough for defense. But that's an independent think tank that published that text.
Okay, so I would like to ask for some of your questions. So, gentlemen over there. If you could please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I will. Petr, European Commission. We are celebrating enlargement, so my question will be related to enlargement. The 3 speakers will represent the EU, Czech Republic, and NATO. We have another enlargement, or another anniversary, not enlargement. 30 years ago, we were offered Partnership for Peace. I think we gladly forgot that anniversary today. And then the pattern was first NATO, and then the EU. What about Ukraine?
First of all, I do not represent the EU here. As I said, look, 1995 study on NATO enlargement provided with several parameters for assessment of the candidates. And indeed, one of them was that actually the country has solved its or has no outstanding issues concerning its borders. So at the same time, I mean, there are various discussions about EU membership for Ukraine. Actually, this is moving well. We are in war. I mean, so to make any comparison to the previous processes of NATO enlargement and now the situation in Ukraine, it would lead us nothing, nowhere. Sorry. So let's be very cautious about this analogy: EU first and NATO later.
I will be much simpler. I think the security is the safe basis for other things to build upon. So in my logic, to enter NATO first and EU later makes sense historically. I don't know how it's going to unfold with Ukraine. Ukraine in NATO, our government's position is supportive. We are support of the Ukrainian membership. The question is that Ukraine cannot enter whilst in a war. That's absolutely logical. And that's why we need to curb our emotions in that sense, confirm our promise, because empirically, NATO has never been attacked. So the only really sensible guarantee is the one your adversary believes in. And in this sense, it makes sense to promise membership, but it doesn't make sense to promise a date of membership. So first the conflict, then the stabilization, however the conflict ends up, and then following through on the promises, because there is no other credible guarantee for European security than Europe whole and free, as mentioned in the North Atlantic Treaty.
Along similar lines. At the same time, you know, I've been with NATO since the beginning, and I remember. Well, honestly, this is as far as I remember, since 2002, when Ukraine first said she wanted to join NATO. I cannot remember the time that Ukraine was actually closer to NATO than now, for a number of reasons. You know, there are still issues clearly to be solved. President Zelensky himself said that it's very clear that Ukraine cannot join while fighting war with Russia. That's very clear. But well, we have done a number of things. We simplified the process. You know, the next step will not be membership action plan. You know, for Ukraine, which was actually in 2008 was the next step, the next precondition for ultimate for the invitation. We created something called NATO Ukraine Council, which actually is one level above the NATO Ukraine Commission. I'm sorry for the bureaucracies, but it actually does make a lot of difference. But ultimately, what really matters is that Ukraine prevails in this war. And by the way, I think there is indeed a very clear link. You alluded to it between NATO and EU membership. The fact that NATO sort of moved also, was triggered by the fact that Ukraine is now a candidate for the EU. So I think there's a very clear link, as you suggested.
So next question. Okay, in the middle.
Hello, Václav Šebel, European Commission. When Western Germany was admitted to NATO in 1955, it didn't have its borders stabilized, and there were plenty of proxy wars going on between the Soviet Union and the Western camp. So how is the situation different? How was the situation different back then? And are we a bit cowardly today in comparison?
If I may, I'll be quick. The borders were very stable despite the situation specific to West Berlin. It was an occupied country. divided into basically zones of interests, and it was cemented, and everybody trusts in the line in the sand that is inviolable. So it is different in every sense. And also it made sense to make Germany whole and fully in NATO afterwards, which basically opened, and Germany was against it for a long period of time, Genscher and so on, opened a way for us because it would be very unjustified.
May I just add something? You wanted to?
No, you are a historian.
No, whatever. No, I'm glad that you asked that question because it's usually me asking that question to others, you know. So but I will give you the answer that I normally give. Well, indeed, the border, the stable border is one thing. There was also when Germany joined in 1955, was very clear understanding on the part of the Adenauer government that there were not. Although the Free Republic, the West German government actually saw itself as the representative of the German people, actually until reunification, that the next day after Germany actually joined NATO will not start a war with the Soviet Union. Yeah, that was very clear. There is an I think administrative way of solving that issue. Once because the Ukrainians will never admit that part of their territory is not theirs. But indeed, I think it's Article 6 of the Washington Treaty, which actually taxatively states which areas are covered by Article 5. And France, joined NATO in 1949. It was very clearly stated that actually the Washington Treaty covers North African territories. I can imagine, but here I am talking purely speculatively, that this could be solved by basically saying, well, Article 5 now covers only areas which are under the effective control of the Ukrainian government. Mm-hmm.
Very briefly, actually, also the invitation of Germany to NATO was a precondition for rearmament of Germany in view of the growing conventional and above all conventional actually advantage on the part of what at the same year became the Warsaw Treaty Organization, but was organized by the Soviets already before, first. And second, and this is related to that, just remember what the very first Secretary General of NATO, Lord Ismay, said about the purpose of NATO, to keep Americans in, Russians out, and Germans down. Yeah.
But to allude to Ismay, Americans were already in Germany, which is a big difference with Ukraine. The occupation force was in, keeping them down, but also protecting the space. And the same happened in Eastern Germany, which was armed to the teeth by the Soviet army. So there was no movement of forces because the garrisons were there. And also Germany is still, I think, the biggest US garrison in Europe in number of troops. And we should strive as a Czech Republic to increase the pipelines, to move forward the troops. Prepositioning is a big thing, to make Europe whole again in terms of the infrastructure.
Thank you very much. So the very last question, but we will have to close it. So
this may be the last.
So
question.
just one panelist you should ask. Okay.
One panelist. I address this to NATO. If we look realistically at the situation in Ukraine, I'm not sure the democratic governments are going to come up with the money. The United States is stalled. We have no idea when they may contribute this $60 billion that they say. In the meantime, sort of like calling the fire department. And they come a month after the fire broke out. Where's the fire? Well, what we have is completely burned down. So that's one thing. And Zelensky and other people already said that if we do not get this help, material help, the war is lost. And on the other hand, Jens Stoltenberg has said we cannot afford to lose. We cannot let Russia win this war.
Okay,
so
I understand.
What is the outcome?
Okay, so who wants to respond? Perhaps Jiří. Okay, and you can obviously, it's very interesting, and some of you would enjoy to discuss until the early at the morning, but I promise you can discuss with some of the panelists during the refreshments and drinks downstairs. But now, response to this very pessimistic, some would say very realistic question or remark. So it's up to Jiří now.
Sorry, I had a bit of problem of grasping the question. But what happens if we stop supporting Ukraine with money? Or I mean, it's no. We should not even consider this. Yeah.
U.S. leadership is very important. I think everybody, all eyes to Washington. It will be very important to defend the Washington summit when the money is not on the way. Second thing, we will have to all live with the consequences, Ukraine included. Consequences will have two orders of magnitude. First, the world order is gone. Member of the Security Council, nuclear armed, conquers a country in its vicinity and imposes some kind of different regime and occupational force. The end of the world as we know it, basically, for Ukraine. Are we ready to live with ourselves, to look in the mirror in the morning, if we leave Ukraine to be swallowed by the aggressor? Second thing, and the third thing, our defense expenditure will grow tremendously. And US kept their own. They have still 800 billion, still almost 70% of the expenditure is the US. Europe is struggling to get back. The statistics that Petr brought is correct. But we need to do more because a lot is expected from us. And now there is an opportunity for European leadership, European strategic autonomy, because let's face it, this war threatens Europe much more as a continent than North America, governed by the two modes of the two world oceans.
Thank you, Jakub. So as I promised, you can discuss with panelists or also from the previous panel during the drinks. So I would like to thank all of you for coming and participating. I would like to thank all the panelists, Jiří, Šedivý, Jakub, Landovský, Petr, Luňák. And above all, once again, I would like to thank Prague House for hosting us generously. I would like to thank Renew Europe and Martin Hlaváček who arranged it. And I would like to thank to my team in the Institute for Politics and Society for spending a lot of time to work on this. So refreshment is downstairs, and I hope you will enjoy the rest of the evening. And thanks for coming, and we are looking forward to see you again. So thanks again, Lucia. And see, we have Lucia arranged 2 cakes, which are real cakes, really. So.